Good evening, everyone. I'm Hugh Hewitt, president of the Nixon Foundation. Tonight's meeting of the Nixon Seminar, the October meeting, concerns itself with President Biden's August decisions in Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the consequences to that country, the nation, and the world. It is co-chaired by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former National Security Advisor to President Trump, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, and participated in by the 15 members of the Nixon Seminar. You can see all of their bios and their backgrounds at nixonseminar.com. With that, we will begin with a short introduction from Ambassador O'Brien, then from Secretary of State Pompeo, and then from Congressman Waltz. Then we will open it to the floor for comments, questions, and statements. Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you, Hugh, and it's good to be with you. Greetings from California. Look, we suffered a catastrophe when it comes to foreign policy with the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's a debacle that will stain us as a country for many, many years to come. I was a young man and remember the withdrawal from Saigon, the chaotic scene of the Chinook helicopters and the Hueys landing on the roof of our embassy and bringing Americans home. And I lived through it the next several weeks as my mom volunteered down at Camp Pendleton to help take care of young Vietnamese children that had been sent home by their parents or been sent to America by their parents to avoid communism. What we saw in the 4 years following that catastrophic withdrawal from Saigon, that again, I didn't think would be repeated in my lifetime, was the Soviet Union at the time on the march, whether it was in Mozambique or Angola or Nicaragua, Cuba, expanding its influence around the globe, ultimately ending with the invasion of Afghanistan itself in 1980 by the former Soviet Union. It took us getting Ronald Reagan back in office to restore American credibility. So let me just touch briefly on the withdrawal, which people have asked about. And folks say, well, President Trump was in favor of withdrawal. Robert O'Brien was in favor of withdrawal. Mike Pompeo was in favor of withdrawal. Where we were when we left office is we had 2,500 American troops on the ground. That was sufficient to protect our embassy and to enable our counterterrorism operators at various government agencies that were active in Afghanistan at the time. Backed up by we were backed up by NATO troops, 5,000 of which had come from Western Europe and Turkey. That was an accomplishment of diplomacy that Secretary Pompeo was engaged in with his team. That we engaged in. I think Mike and I were on the phone with Jens Stoltenberg almost every week, because burden sharing didn't just mean the 2% goal for GDP defense spending by our NATO allies. It meant sending troops into harm's way to fight and secure American and Western vital interests. So when we left office, there were 7,500 troops, American and NATO there. Kabul was free and safe. And we weren't facing the catastrophe that ended up occurring. The withdrawal of those troops was always going to be condition-based, and that was, number one, no attacks on America or our Western allies, our NATO allies in Afghanistan. Those conditions were broken shortly after we took office with an attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman that Mike Gallagher asked about in the various hearings, the House hearings with our leaders. We also had as a condition, this is something that I don't want to step in on the Secretary's bailiwick here, but we had a condition that the Taliban engage in good faith negotiations with the existing government, the government of President Ghani. Now, that government wasn't perfect, and there were issues with it, and there's always been corruption in Afghanistan. But the idea was to have a transitional government and a government of national unity. The problem was, once the new administration came in and announced a date certain for leaving and basically took the position that a conditions-based withdrawal was no longer in effect, there was very little leverage to encourage the Taliban or to push the Taliban into negotiating with the government of Afghanistan and coming up with some sort of transition government that would have been much better for the people of Afghanistan. So had we had to leave, the plan was very simple. American citizens out first. After that, Afghan citizens who enabled us, who helped us, our interpreters, our locally employed staff at the embassy, those that assisted us in sensitive military operations, the pilots, the special operators that were especially at risk if the Taliban was going to take over. And then lastly, we were going to bring our equipment home. And anyone who spent time with President Trump in the Oval Office understood that he said this every time we talked about Afghanistan. I don't want to leave one bolt. I don't want to leave one nail. I don't want to leave one tent behind. I don't want to see the Taliban driving around in Humvees or MRAPs. Certainly the idea that they've got advanced night vision goggles, that they've got Scan Eagle drones, that they have a Black Hawk fleet bigger than Australia's, that just would not have happened even if we'd made the decision to withdraw all forces from Afghanistan. Although I think the president, by the end of his administration, realized that by leaving 2,500 troops there, he'd substantially met the goal that he'd set for the American people of getting out of Afghanistan, and those troops are there to protect our interest. So there's a lot of time now for the blame game. We've got congressional oversight. Mike Waltz has done a great job on that. Mike Gallagher's done a super job. So we've actually had members of our seminar involved in oversight, and we'll get to the bottom of what happened. But we need to take steps immediately. We don't have 4 years like we had in the Carter years. The world moves too fast today. We have to restore American credibility and American leadership now. And there are a number of things that we can do. And I've written about this with Alex Gray and one of our seminar members in a Wall Street Journal op-ed. I wrote about it earlier, a couple of weeks earlier. We have to fortify Taiwan immediately. The first thing that happened after the disaster in Kabul was a Global Times editorial, the mouthpiece of the Communist Party of China, aimed at the people of Taipei. And the editorial basically said, this is your future. Look at what's happening in Kabul now. The Americans were there for 20 years. They had troops on the ground, and they've left the people of Kabul to the mercy of the Taliban. This is what's going to happen to you when we ultimately launch our amphibious invasion of Taiwan. This is where you're going to be. You're going to be surrendering. It's going to be chaos, and the Americans won't be there for you. We need to help Taiwan become that porcupine that we've been talking about. We need to get them missiles. We need to get them sea mines. We need to get them, we need to encourage them to put together a civil defense force that could engage in or at least present a credible counterinsurgency threat to the PLA. So those are some of the things we need to do with Taiwan. In the Pacific, we have to immediately sign up for the Compact of Free Association. That's our treaty deal with Palau, Marshall Islands, and Micronesia. That's been a deal that's been in place for many years. It gives us access, military and foreign policy access to a vast swath of the Pacific. It's being held up now because the Postal Service wants more money to deliver mail. And look, I'm in favor of making sure the postman gets paid. Everyone likes our mail carriers, but we're going to be about to spend $3.5 trillion on who knows what. Let's pay the postal workers in the Marshall Islands and Palau and Micronesia and get that COFA signed and keep China out of a huge area in the Pacific. We need to get tanks to Poland. Poland has come forward and is paying for 250 brand new M1A2 Abrams tanks that'll be built in Lima, Ohio. Close and near and dear to Hugh's heart. Let's send 250 tanks in the meantime that we've got at our depots that have been demobilized from the 3rd Armored Cav and other former heavy armor divisions. Let's do a lend-lease or send tanks to Poland now while their new tanks are being built. Let them get trained up, and let's have a steel curtain that confronts the Russians on the old border between East and West. We need icebreakers. We were very close to leasing icebreakers before leaving office that we would have given to the Coast Guard and gotten up to the Arctic, and that would have allowed our heavy icebreaker to get down to Antarctica. We could even forward base it in Australia and let the Australians burden share with the Polar Star, but keep the Chinese from doing whatever they want in Antarctica and avoiding treaty obligations. And let's put a cutter in American Samoa. I mean, people talk about caring about Asian Pacific Islanders, and except they don't care about Pacific Islanders when they're actually under threat and their livelihood is being destroyed by illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing by Chinese fishing fleets. Let's protect American Pacific Islanders in America Samoa in the Pacific. So those are some of the things we could do that would enjoy bipartisan support. They would not cost a lot of money, but they would start to show that after this catastrophe that we suffered through in Afghanistan, that America is reasserting leadership in the most critical areas in the Indo-Pacific region and in Eastern Europe. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to share a few thoughts here. I'm looking forward to hearing from the seminar, but especially looking forward to hearing from my good friend, Mike Pompeo. I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Thank you, Robert. Thanks, everyone. Good evening. I don't know that in the Afghanistan debate, I'd heard the postal workers brought in before, so well played, Robert. I would love to have a discussion about the Postal Service and its unions sometime too, but for another night. I thought I'd start with just a little bit of history. Hugh, you'd asked us to think about the connectivity, the places where President Nixon faced some of the same decisions that President Trump faced, or President Obama, frankly, before him, and then ultimately President Biden, about a war that had become unpopular at home. Presidents have to make those difficult decisions. There's always the idea of sunk cost and resources that have been used and lives that have been lost, and whether you have to continue so it can be worthy. President Trump certainly faced that. President Biden would have faced that same set of decisions. I think it's worth thinking a little bit about how they are different decisions. Remember, the Vietnam War was fundamentally different. There had not been an attack on the homeland. We had an attack from al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. The context was different too. The threat was there from the theory that nation states and the dominoes might fall in Vietnam. The threat to the United States from al-Qaeda is a global threat and remains a global threat. And so the risk profile and the American interests that the presidents were facing were, I think, very different. And when President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger were talking about peace with honor, I think we can all agree that whatever we got from Afghanistan in the closing weeks is hard to describe as peace and is most certainly not honorable. We came into the administration with a president who had tweeted about wanting to get every last uniformed military person out of Afghanistan. So none of us on this seminar, not a single Taliban fighter, not a single Afghan government official didn't understand the president's intentions with respect to reducing the American cost and the American footprint there. That continued for our entire 4 years. The president couldn't have been more clear when he was speaking with President Ghani or Abdullah, or with any of the other actors in Afghanistan with whom he spoke, that he believed that the time was appropriate for America to reduce its risk in Afghanistan. Know that we always tried to think about this in the context, the greater context in which Afghanistan sits. It's easy to shout Afghanistan, 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 but it sits in South Central Asia, and the juxtaposition between the Iranians, the Pakistanis, and the Chinese and their close proximity presents a very complicated set of issues. And we always tried to make decisions about each of those actions, our policy with Iran, our policy with Pakistan, and our China policy, in the context of knowing too that we had this risk that continued to exist inside of Afghanistan. We were mindful too that the Bush administration had sent our boys and girls there to crush al-Qaeda, and that we in fact did successfully defeat al-Qaeda there. And that's not about an announcement of victory. It's just a simple mathematical equation. The biggest footprints for al-Qaeda today no longer sit inside of Afghanistan, or for that matter, even in the AfPak region. They sit in places where al-Shabaab resides and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And there's risk from al-Qaeda in many parts of the world. And indeed, al-Qaeda's most senior leadership, the people who are working to develop complex attacks to put at risk American interests, not only American interests here at home, but American interests around the world, no longer sit in Karachi. They no longer sit in Kandahar. Those individuals today sit in Tehran. And you have to, in my judgment, as you think about the right military footprint in Afghanistan, you have to keep in mind risk to the United States. And you have to put all of that in context of the greater risk from al-Qaeda. Look, we know it's a special place in history for the United States because we had an attack launch from there. We know that the caves in Tora Bora present ungoverned space with real risk, but the United States and the Trump administration were serious about trying to place that risk in the context of all the other places that resources were required, and to make sure that we had the footprint right. Last thought on that particular piece, everyone talks about the number of uniformed military personnel on the ground. I'm always trying to be very precise when I talk about this, because of course the costs associated with this conflict in Afghanistan and the ultimate protection from the risk of al-Qaeda terrorism from Afghanistan is much bigger than the cost of just the number of troops there. Who can forget President Trump in the first summer of his presidency going to Fort Myer, and Secretary of Defense Mattis had pushed him and he added some 3,000 soldiers there. And we ultimately wound that number down, each time pausing, each time at 8,600, 8,700, then again at 4,500 or 4,600, each time pausing to get that footprint right so that we could present to the president the relative risks associated with further decline in the number of folks there. I worked my tail off to get us as close to zero and as quickly as we possibly could. We were mindful that we had other constraints that we had to work our way through too. You should all step back one moment too and remember where this was in the American mind. Secretary of Defense Esper, when he was the nominee to be the Secretary of Defense, sat for a several-hour hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee. The word Afghanistan was not used during that hearing, not once. If you think about what that says about how those national security leaders were thinking about Afghanistan, or perhaps more appropriately, not thinking very much about Afghanistan, I think it tells you that the direction we were headed to try and create the conditions where we could find a path to have our uniform military presence there at zero or close was the right solution. I think President Trump had that right. We never quite got to the place where we could all recommend to the president that we would make that final decision. I had seen the other elements of American power deployed there as well. Talked about other costs, right? We still were funding the Afghan National Defense Forces. We were continuing to fund enormous corruption inside of Afghanistan. We cannot forget that President Ghani himself stole an awful lot of money from the American taxpayers during his time in office. And that while he claims to have won an election in Afghanistan, it was an election that was incredibly fraught and very close, and where there was indeed corruption itself. This was a very complex set of constraints that were sitting on the United States. And as CIA director, I knew that there were other resources, other tools available to do all that we needed to do to protect America's interest. And while I can't say much more about that, the narrow focus on the number of U.S. military personnel on the ground there seems to me to be very short-sighted and would often, if you focused on it too much, lead to the wrong set of answers to the important questions about America's role there. I think Ambassador O'Brien gave you a good rundown of the results that happened when President Biden set a date certain, that arbitrary date of September 11th. He moved it. I don't believe, had we gotten to the place where we were intending to move to zero uniform military personnel, that we would have done it in this way. Robert talked about the plan that we had laid out and we had articulated to not only my team at the State Department, but to the team at the Department of Defense. And I can't speak to precisely how this unrolled inside the Biden administration, but it certainly appears he was stubborn, set a date certain, denied resources to his military team that was clearly advising him that there was a lot of risk to go below 25 or 2,600. And the resultant effect is you still have Americans today that I know a whole bunch of people in this seminar are working their tails off to try and help get out. And I wanted to say to those of you who I've had contact with and who I haven't, and I know are working on this problem set, God bless you. We all still have a responsibility to get them home. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over and hear from other seminar members. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Congressman Waltz.
Yeah, thanks you, and yeah, thanks Robert. Thank you, Mike. You know, for those that I don't quite know as well, you know, many of you do know that I've worked this obviously out on the ground as a special operations officer, but importantly from the Bush White House as Vice President Cheney's counterterrorism advisor, also in the Pentagon under Secretaries Rumsfeld and Gates. So I have to be one of the only, you know, knuckleheads in DC that actually had to go do the strategy I helped write. And then it was my rear end on the ground, and then to come back and say, hey, boss, here's what's going right and here's what's going wrong, and did that back and forth several times, and had some highlights in there, including leading the search for Bo Bergdahl, being present the day of the CIA bombing at Fob Chapman. Actually had half of that base, and it was one of the worst days of my life, and poor Jen Matthews and her great sacrifice. But look, I think this is the end of the day, this is a disaster from 5 different perspectives. One, obviously, we have an ongoing hostage crisis, and despite the administration's spin, that's exactly what it is. And the Taliban government, the Haqqanis, and Al Qaeda have the leverage. Period. And Blinken, for reasons that are still very unclear to me, is either clueless or lying about the numbers of Americans still there. I was just on the phone today with a veterans organization that was looking at a manifest of 120 Americans. A plane just landed Thursday with 116. And we just got 7 across the Tajikistan border just last week. So, he's putting this interesting caveat in there, 100 that wanted to leave. And I'd love, candidly ask him if he would leave his family behind. Of course he wouldn't. And therefore doesn't deserve to put those people in a category of not wanting to leave. Crisis number 2 is from a human rights standpoint. We have already seen that the Taliban have never changed. And from barring women from work in universities to the retribution and the ongoing killings that are going on. I unfortunately wake up to multiple videos a day of these beatings, tortures, and killings. The UN has already issued a report, the Amnesty International, and a number of other groups. 3, Robert already spoke to our credibility and the damage that's occurring not just in Taiwan, but in Ukraine, in the Baltics, and in other places. 4, from a counterterrorism standpoint, Al-Qaeda equals the Taliban, the Taliban equals Al-Qaeda. And the intelligence is clear on that. The military was clear on that. The DNI, Avril Haines, was clear on it. So I'm not sure who Biden is listening to in that regard, but Ayman Zawahiri has sworn bayat, has sworn allegiance to the head of the Taliban, and that has not changed further. I think the analogy here is we're heading down a repeat of what we saw in Iraq under the Obama team. There, we pulled out in 11, went to 0. A number of analysts were banging the drum and sounding the alarm at the rise of ISIS, the morph from Al-Qaeda into ISIS. And then we saw them explode on the scene just a few years later in 2014 and almost take the Baghdad government. I fear we're going to see that repeat, but it's going to be far worse because we'll have far fewer tools when we have to go back to deal with it than we had in Iraq, from everything from ocean access to allies on the ground to the bases that we have in the region. So the fiction that the Biden administration is selling people with over-the-horizon counterterrorism, I think, is incredibly dangerous. It is very easy and sounds quite plausible for President Biden, Blinken, and others to say, well, look, we do counterterrorism in places like Mogadishu and Syria and Libya, and we can do the same in Afghanistan. That ignores geography. It ignores the fact that we have no bases in any neighboring country. It ignores the fact that a drone-only strategy will not work, that those drones burn 80% of their fuel just in the flight there and back and have very little loiter time. And I firmly believe, should we exercise lethal attacks again, that Pakistan will be under enormous pressure to close those airways, which we are completely reliant on. And they have a long history of doing that with ground supplies. And then finally, with our ground supply lines. And then finally, it's a disaster from a great power competition. That was another reason that Biden used to justify that we had to get out of Iraq to worry about China. Well, Bagram Air Base was the only base in the world sandwiched between China, Russia, and Iran. Just 340 miles from the Chinese border and just a few hundred more miles from their brand new ICBM fields that they're putting in the ground in Xinjiang. And a question that I asked in the hearing, in one of the hearings, was if, I know it's a bit hypothetical, but I think we all know the answer. The distance from Bagram to the Chinese border was the same distance from Monterrey, Mexico to San Antonio. And do we think for a second, if the Chinese had an air base in Mexico, if they would have given it up for nothing? I think not. And then finally, I'll just leave on this happy note. General Milley testified he thinks it's a decent likelihood this descends into civil war. I think it's far more dangerous than that. From a worst case scenario, I think it descends into a regional proxy war. The Tajiks are incredibly nervous. The president of Tajikistan has said he is not going to stand by as their ethnic brothers and sisters are slaughtered. And make no mistake, what's going on in the Panjshir Valley right now is a genocide. The Indians are incredibly nervous, as they should be, because I think the first place we see American-made night vision, body armor, and weapons is in the Kashmir at the hands of the Haqqani's brothers in arms, Lashkar-e-Taiba, and they're not going to stand for that ongoing instability. And so I think we have the real possibility of this descending into absolute chaos with regional actors stepping in line with their own interests, except the difference between here and other places is obviously we have a nuclear environment with two sworn enemies in Pakistan and India. And in the hearings, we really, what was so disappointing to so many of my constituents who are blowing my phones up is just the absolute lack of accountability. Not even an apology. No one who said that here's how this could have and should have been done better. We frankly just saw a lot of spin. So I think on that happy note, Hugh, everybody's going to want to drink more after hearing from the three of us. But happy to answer any questions. I think we, from a congressional oversight standpoint, still have a long way to go to get answers. And namely, top of my list is the role of Pakistan, the numerous reports of heavy Pakistani involvement, amongst other things that we need to get to the bottom of.
Thank you, Mike. The secretary and the ambassador's lines are always open if they want to jump in. Kimberly Reed has sent me a text message. She'd like to take the floor. Kimberly?
Good evening. It's great to be with everyone after a great summer. And I'm in Marietta, Ohio, cleaning out my grandparents' house built by my great-grandfather in 1912. And what did I come across today? Lots of newspapers about President Nixon. And so I'll be donating these to the library, but it serves as a great reminder of we really need to look at history and take lessons from that. So I would be interested in hearing from the secretary and the ambassador and the congressman. So I'm looking here, Nixon stops military action in Viet. So 1973 Paris Peace Accords. We know how that turned out. What lessons would you hope the Biden administration would be taking note of as we go forward? This is extremely troubling to me. I'd also like to just really commend groups like Digital Dunkirk, and would love to know if you've talked with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan or Susan Rice, who used to be the head of the national security team, is now in domestic policy, but just love a little more inside baseball and what's going on.
Mr. Secretary?
Just one thought. You talked about the Paris Peace Accords. They were a failure. In the end, when you try to generate a better set of outcomes, the president always kept saying, let's work on peace and reconciliation. You have to do two things. One is you have to be eyes wide open about who they are. We never forgot who these Taliban bastards were. Not once. We knew that without real leverage, and I think it was Congressman Waltz, or maybe it was Ambassador Bryan, who said that America has zero leverage there today. I think zero may well overstate the amount of leverage we have to impact what's going on the ground there today. I actually think the Biden administration is actively seeking to turn the page and not even working to use whatever tools they might have to achieve good outcomes for what remains our interest there in Afghanistan. But second, you not only need to remember who you're negotiating with, but you need to realize that there's a long tail on these things. So whether it was the work there in Vietnam that Dr. Kissinger did, or the work that was done trying to bring the FARC inside the government in Colombia, these are rough efforts. These the chance that the tiger changes its stripes is very low. So you consistently have to make sure that it's not about some document, it's not about words on a page, but rather it's about the power that can be brought to bear to effectuate the outcome that you're seeking. We knew full well that our discussions with the Taliban would be measured in years, not weeks or months. We were prepared to try to lay the groundwork to see if there wasn't a possibility that 2, 5, 10, 15 years from now, we couldn't find a path forward in Afghanistan that was different from the one that Congressman Waltz described, right? He talked about civil war. Is there a way to solve what's now 100 years old set of grievances that can at least accommodate the varied interests there? And I think if you said, well, what are the twin lessons from this? It is that the moment that American interests are protected by real leverage, not a document, then you can see precisely what we have seen these past now 90 days in Afghanistan.
Jonathan Burks.
Thanks, Hugh. Mr. Secretary, Ambassador, Congressman, I appreciate your taking the time this afternoon. I'm struck, there's a person probably familiar to many of us, Freddie Clay, who served in the Nixon administration and went on to serve again in Ford and Reagan, and was an advisor to many members of Congress over the years until his relatively recent passing. Wrote a great book called Every War Must End. And in it, he sort of challenges policymakers to think through what the end condition is that we would like to see as we engage in a conflict. And I think ultimately, sort of the end of Vietnam, the end of Afghanistan, both of those are in part failures of, sort of the elite foreign policy of administrations from the beginning of those conflicts to envision how is that we win? What does it look like at the end that, and how do we get to that end state? And so I'm just wondering if there are things that going forward we can do to be better at ensuring that we have sort of that end state in mind, and that end state really guides our conduct of the conflict from day one through the end of a conflict.
Going to stick with you on that, Mr. Secretary.
Sure, I'll let Ambassador Bryan speak to this as well. I think that is so simple and clear as to be obvious to each of us that we've got to think about what that looks like. In this sense, it's not the Biden administration that got this wrong, thinking about the end. They certainly messed up the end, but we had 20 years where we didn't generate a force that had any possibility of surviving without continued American military resources. And I don't just mean our 2,500 folks on the ground. I mean making payroll. I mean the glue inside the political government out of our embassy in Kabul. Continued infighting inside the political establishment and inside the security establishment inside of Afghanistan. We hadn't done any of the things that when one contemplated how this would wrap up, we hadn't prepared the folks that we were supporting, who were fighting against the people who have tried to kill Americans and will still continue to try to kill Americans. We hadn't done the work right. We hadn't trained them properly. We hadn't done that hard work. You know, there were lots of senior military guys, folks who were my classmates at West Point, who were responsible for the anti-corruption efforts in Afghanistan. I mean, right? It boggles one's mind to think that after 2 decades, that frankly, while the military was better trained and better prepared, it was woefully inadequate to survive in the absence of any kind of political leadership or any military tactic trainings and procedures that could fight what is this Taliban army that, didn't have an air force, didn't have remotely the intelligence capabilities that we had been providing. And we left that country in a place where the likely outcome, not a random outcome as President Biden has suggested, but a likely outcome was the one that we saw.
Ambassador O'Brien.
Yeah, I'll echo what Mike had to say. Some of you may not know this. I served in the Bush administration and then briefly into the Obama administration on a rule of law program for Afghanistan, trying to end some of the corruption that was taking place in the judiciary and among the prosecutors. I remember going to Afghanistan with a Marine hero, Dave Carter, who went on to become a federal judge and is still a federal judge out in Orange County. And we sat down with a group of 10 or 15 Afghan prosecutors, and Dave bluntly asked them, as he's wont to do, who here is corrupt and who takes bribes, and not one hand raised. And then he said, who knows somebody who takes bribes and is corrupt, and every hand raised. And it was clear what we were dealing with. And then a couple we were trying to promote women into the judiciary and in the prosecutor ranks, and And some of the guys pulled us aside and said, well, it's easy for them not to be corrupt. Their husband has to have jobs, and so they don't have to take the bribes that we have to take. Everybody was on the take in Afghanistan, and it was a terrible situation. We tried to stop in the Bush administration. I was called into with another Republican, Ambassador Pierre Prosper. He and I flew to Afghanistan to meet with the Karzai government and asked them to please stop taking bribes. And as we were leaving, a senior Pakistani intelligence officer was walking in with a suitcase that we were later told was full of cash. So obviously our message didn't get very far. A couple of quick points on the idea of Jonathan's question about the end game. Number one, we just can't get in the habit of leaving Americans behind. That's not who we are as a country. We don't do that with the military. We don't do that with our civilians. Before becoming national security advisor, I worked for Mike as the hostage envoy, and he backed me up every hour of every day. And we went around the world, whether it was to Algeria or North Korea or Iran, Venezuela, Turkey, Russia, to get Americans, some of whom had, may not have been smart in how they got themselves captured or detained or held hostage, but our goal was to bring every single American home. And we can't get in the habit of excusing this idea that Americans maybe shouldn't have been there. They should have known better to go to Afghanistan, and therefore we're going to leave them behind. That's just not what we do as a country. And I want to thank, I know there are people on this call, and I've been involved in Mike has, but Congressman Waltz, your office has been terrific in helping to get folks home, both visa holders and enablers, Afghans, but also American citizens. Morgan Ortegas did a great job early on when the airport was still open, working with her contacts in Qatar to help us get 25 people that were involved in the rule of law program that we had trained back in the day, and Morgan was involved in that and getting them out and getting them to Canada. John Noonan hates seeing emails from me because he's a staffer at Senator Cotton's office, and the only sit room on trying to get Americans home was Senator Cotton's office, and he was running rescue operations out of the Senate. And that's it's commendable, and I'm grateful for what John did and what Tom Cotton did. But this should have been happening at the State Department, and had we still been in office, I guarantee you that Mike Pompeo would have had the ops center running, with reinforcements and going around the clock, getting our folks home, and there would have been no thought of leaving Americans behind. So that's number one, Jonathan. If we're going to leave and we decide to get out of a place, we don't leave with our, certainly with our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardmen behind, but we don't leave our Americans behind. Number two, look, part of the rationale for leaving Afghanistan was to pivot to the Indo-Pacific. We have an existential crisis and threat that's going to impact our kids and our grandkids coming from China. And Mike and I spoke about it in long speeches over the course of the summer. Alex Gray was involved in those issues. Alex Wong was, others on this call. Kim Reed took a number of trips. Mary Kissel, and I can look around. Nadia wrote the Great Power Competition document. No one was more involved than Pottinger, going around the world, whether it was places I can't mention and on missions I can't mention, fighting this. So if we really are serious about the reason for leaving Afghanistan being the Indo-Pacific, we've got to take some of those troops that we just pulled out of Afghanistan, and we need to put them in places like Palau, like Okinawa, like Robertson Barracks in Darwin. We need to actually show the world that we mean what we said. So as bad as things were with the departure from Afghanistan, if we're honest, and the reason for pulling those troops out is so we could redeploy them, they ought to be in the Aleutian Islands, they ought to be in Hawaii, they ought to be in American Samoa and Palau and the first and second island chain. And let's take some of those troops and show the world that we meant what we said, and we were serious about the pivot, and it wasn't just a cover for a cut and run out of Afghanistan. So those would be the two responses. Long-winded, Jonathan, but don't leave Americans behind. And number two, do what we said we were going to do. If this was really about pivoting to great power competition in the Pacific, let's move those assets and let's move that treasure that we were spending in Afghanistan and invest it in the Indo-Pacific and confront our greatest threat and our greatest adversary there.
Thank you, Ambassador. For the benefit of our technical team, I'm going to go to Morgan Ortegas, then Dr. Crowley, then Christian Witten, then John Noonan, and then Dr. Shadlow. Morgan Ortegas.
Thank you so much, Hugh. I would say one of the things that has been very emotional about the past 6 weeks is everyone on this call, all of my friends and colleagues on this call, we're mostly in our 40s and our 30s, and this is our war, right? This is the war that we have all served in some sort of capacity, whether it's diplomatic, intel, military. Most of us, I think almost everyone on this call has been in Afghanistan at some point in the past 20 years. And the thing that kept just ringing over and over in my head is that I knew that Mike Pompeo would have never, ever left Americans behind or let it end this way. And if there's anything that haunts me over the last 6 weeks, it's not the blame game. It's the fact that it didn't have to end this way. This many people didn't have to die. Our American troops didn't have to die at the airport. And so I think that the fact that that haunts me, and I think it haunts all of my colleagues who have served like I have in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think we should channel that. You know, one of the interesting things that I saw a parallel in the readings and the overview of the Nixon strategy in Vietnam, I'm just going to read one sentence. It said, Nixon felt that America's reputation as a dependable ally and role as a great power working for peace around the world would depend on the way the United States dealt with ending the Vietnam War. And if that quote isn't so prescient for what we're dealing with today, I don't know what is. You know, Robert, at the beginning, you talked about exactly what the Chinese said in their letter and their open statements to the Taiwanese as we were leaving Afghanistan. So my question for you and the Secretary is, what parallels are there between us leaving Afghanistan and Taiwan? Obviously, we all know what's in the news with the Chinese Air Force's incursions into Taiwanese air defense space over the past few days. So I'm just curious, what are the parallels as we sort of transition our mind to thinking about China, as Robert just talked about? What are the parallels, if there are any, and what do we learn?
So let me address that very quickly. I won't be as long as I was, and then turn it over to Mike. The difference between Taiwan and Afghanistan, the geopolitical difference is immense. Look, it was important that we were in Afghanistan. I'm grateful for all my friends and colleagues who fought there. I was there as a diplomat a number of times, both in the Bush administration and in this administration, and it was important. But the United States can afford geopolitically to survive what happened, the catastrophe that would happen in Afghanistan. We can't afford to survive the loss of Taiwan. Geopolitically, if you look at Taiwan, it's the cork in the champagne bottle in the first island chain that keeps the PLA Army and People's Liberation Army and People's Liberation Army Navy bottled up. If Taiwan goes, our allies in the Northern Pacific, Japan, Korea, are cut off from our treaty allies, the Philippines and Thailand and Australia in the South. The Chinese have open access to the entire second island chain, including Hawaii, including the Aleutians, including the West Coast. The maintaining of a friendly power in Taiwan is absolutely critical to the United States geopolitically going forward. Number two, just from a humanitarian point of view, unlike Afghanistan, Taiwan is a tremendous democracy. It transitioned from authoritarianism to democracy. It's the greatest story of such a transition, I think, in my lifetime, more than Colombia, more than South Africa. It's just amazing what the Taiwanese people have done. And to relegate them to a fake one country, two systems where they end up like the people of Hong Kong and lose their freedom and lose their democracy is something that would be just heartbreaking to me and I think most Americans. So from a geopolitical standpoint, Taiwan is absolutely critical to the continued defense of America and its allies in the Pacific. And from a humanitarian basis, this is a great democracy, great rule of law, and the type of country we need to support, as Americans. And so, some differences. Obviously, the way we left Afghanistan was terrible, but we can't afford to lose Taiwan. It just it's too dangerous to us as a country, and morally would be reprehensible. Mr. Secretary.
Thanks, Robert. I'll be very brief. I know we've got a lot of folks who want to talk. I'd say two things really quick. One, We shouldn't forget the economic impact of Taiwan as well. A whole bunch of our technology depends on the capacity for a number of companies there in Taiwan to deliver that equipment to us here in the United States. I promise you the CCP doesn't want that to continue.
Yeah.
Second, when this isn't so much the difference between these two, but we should be mindful that American credibility wasn't just damaged in Afghanistan. Within a handful of weeks, the administration de-designated the Iranian terrorists in Yemen, the Houthis. Within a matter of weeks after that, the Iranians fired missiles through their proxies in the Gaza Strip into our friend and ally, the state of Israel. And not long after that, they gave the Russians a pipeline and shut down energy in the United States. And we now have WTI trading close to $80 a barrel. These are all things that the world looks at and sees weakness. This is not something that reinforces the capacity for America to deliver on good outcomes for our people all around the world.
Dr. Crowley.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary, Ambassador, Congressman. Great to see everybody tonight. So I was thinking about the connectivity between President Nixon, the fall of Saigon, and what we just witnessed in Afghanistan, the fall of Kabul. And I want to ask about the policy of what was known as Vietnamization, which is shorthand for the United States training, equipping, funding, and then standing up a security force on the ground made up of indigenous forces. And I think about Vietnamization, and the South Vietnamese fought valiantly. The Afghan security forces fought valiantly. And ultimately, the United States did withdraw support for those forces. And then we saw ultimately a collapse in both nations. I don't know if the United States will ever pursue an intervention along these lines, at least not in the foreseeable future. But I'm curious to know your opinions about going about something like this. President Nixon always used to say there's no substitute for American power. And I think that is fundamentally true and will remain so for a while. But should we rethink our approach to these kinds of interventions and then how we exit in terms of standing up an indigenous force and our support for those folks on the ground?
Let me direct it, if I can, to Congressman Waltz, who served as a Green Beret instructor and companion of the Afghan forces as he chronicles and warrior diplomat. Congressman?
Yeah, sure. Happy to answer that. And I think that's one of the real lessons that we need to learn from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and frankly, where we do this all over the world. Vietnamization started very late, relatively late in the war. And frankly, so did truly working by, with, and through the Afghan military. Really not until about 2014, 2015, were we actively putting the Afghans in the lead. Frankly, before then, it was very much whether it was the 82nd Airborne or the Marines or whomever conducting operations somewhat in coordination with the Afghans, but truly putting them in the lead and pulling ourselves into a supporting role. It wasn't a policy choice that we made until well into the war, and the same happened with Vietnamization. I think the model that has worked quite successfully and is in Colombia. And while we may decry corruption in many of these places where we're doing this around the world, Colombia was certainly no exception. If you remember where they were in the 1980s, you had cabinet ministers on the payroll of the various drug cartels. You had airlines being bombed. There were many who predicted that Colombia would completely fall into a narco state. Yet with less than 1,000 special operators working by, with, and through the Colombian military, we were able, and working in coordination with, much closer coordination with our state and aid colleagues, we were really able to turn the situation around. But a couple of pieces there. One, they're still there. They've been there for 40 years, twice as long as we've been in Afghanistan, but they took a very much a supporting role, providing intelligence, command and control, logistics, maintenance, in some cases, limited air support. and we're not out there on the front lines like we found ourselves in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And it was that transition away from that type of mission in Afghanistan in the early days where I think we made somewhat of a blunder. So we've actually done this with corrupt governments, with militaries lacking in capability, but we've done it a lot for a number of reasons. We've done it better in other places in the world than we did in Afghanistan. And then finally, just taking a page from the Nixon years where we did it better. I would encourage everyone to look at the Accords program, which was a program where we truly integrated the military, the State Department, USAID, and our intelligence partners in a unified chain of command under General Creighton Abrams, who replaced General Westmoreland, and was something that he pushed and then the Nixon administration reinforced at the same time they did, at the same time that they really pushed the policy of Vietnamization. Unfortunately, it was the right policy, but too little and too late in terms of political support in Vietnam. And I think the same thing, too little, too late in terms of by, with, and through the Afghans in the Afghan war. Hope that answers your question.
Yes.
Christian Witten.
Thank you, Hugh. Robert, question for you, or maybe also for Matt Pottinger, since it deals with information coming into the White House. And I know Matt also saw combat in Afghanistan, saw the collation of information. It deals with the Taliban and the way they are conducting themselves. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Robert, to say anything other than that the Taliban are completely terrible, awful people, because they are. But I'm surprised, frankly, at the lack of violence involved in the Taliban's governance so far. This could change, but beginning before they took Kabul, they were giving interviews to the BBC, answering some fairly arrogant questions. I was sort of surprised that these local Taliban didn't have the BBC reporters beheaded and were instead engaged in a PR campaign. The PR campaign largely was successful in getting the Afghan army soldiers to drop their weapons and go home without firing a shot. And then you have, of course, the takeover of Kabul. At any time, it seems they could have shut down that airport. It probably wouldn't have taken, a couple of pickup trucks with mortar tubes. You could drive them around, void detection, stop flight operations. They could have presented a military force that probably could have overrun the airport. They could have executed Americans systematically. And there are reports now, of course, of abuses. There, may be a resumption of public executions, although probably for criminals. They don't seem to be systematically herding people off to political re-education camps or just killing them the way you saw in Cambodia after the fall of Phnom Penh or in Vietnam after the fall of Saigon. So the question is, did you see any information coming from our intelligence bureaucracy, our $80 billion a year intelligence bureaucracy, about this change in the Taliban that seems to have occurred from 2001 to 2020? You'd think that INR, the CIA, would be able to not just describe changes in the Christian Democrats in Germany or the Social Democrats in Norway, but actually the political disposition of one of our key enemies in the world. Did you see anything like that?
Yeah, so let me answer that. Yeah, without talking about specific intelligence and that sort of thing. Look, the Taliban responded to American pressure. They responded to sticks, and that's what gave Secretary Pompeo and Ambassador Khalilzad the ability to negotiate with them, is because they knew that if they veered off the path, that they would be hit incredibly hard. And so we conditioned the Taliban to understand that if they didn't abide by every jot and tittle of the agreement, that there would be a severe punishment. And that happened on numerous occasions. Look, as far as what's happening now, I think there are a couple of things, Christian, that the Taliban want. Number one, they want the U.S. out. And as long as we were at the airport and we had, a couple thousand Marines who were not happy with the situation, were ready to break out of that airport and I think sally forth the way that a Hungarian knight would have, in the 16th century and wreaked havoc. They were nervous. They were nervous about Tupera, the British elite unit that was at the airport. They were worried about the French raid squads. They were worried about the Carbonari. And there was a lot of firepower. They wanted that gone because that was a threat to them. As long as we were there, even if we were, not in an ideal situation in the airport, that was a threat and they wanted us out. Number two, they did not want us to help our allies. I mean, if you think about the Taliban, they're in a much better position now than they were on 9/11. And 9/11, we had the Northern Alliance. Guys like Waltz were able to parachute in, and Pottinger, and actually work with allies on the ground and roll up the Taliban relatively quickly. They wanted to make sure that we did not support a reconstitution of the Northern Alliance, and we haven't so far. And that's probably bad for U.S. National interest in the long run, but they've accomplished that. So some of the moderation is probably driven by their desire for us not to get together with Shah's son and others, Dostum and others. Third, it's money. They want cash, and this is, as Congressman Waltz pointed out, this is one of the biggest hostage negotiations that we've ever seen. It's going to involve billions of dollars. It's going to be gussied up as humanitarian aid and Afghan government money being released to the Taliban in exchange for some sort of humanitarian treatment of the U.S. and potentially some Afghan enablers that we want back. So I think they're interested in money. And then finally, I do think there's an element of concern that they have over ISIS-K. They're very tight with Al-Qaeda. I don't think they're as tight with ISIS-K. And they may need to call on us or our allies at some point for some assistance there if ISIS-K starts metastasizing the way that ISIS did in Iraq after we pulled out. So I think there are a number of things that are leading to the so-called moderation, but I wouldn't put much stock in it. And I want to get our Americans out. I want to get our Afghan allies out sooner rather than later before the proverbial mask is pulled off. But let me go to Mike. Secretary Pompeo, do you have any thoughts on Christian's question?
I think Matt was going to say something. I'll let Matt go.
Hey, thanks. Now, I think Robert covered pretty much everything. I just add that, the Taliban wants to make it easier on China to defend them at the UN because that's their pipeline for money. And that could be one reason that you've seen relative, I guess, forbearance. The other issue is that they're still consolidating power. Robert was talking about, the fact you still got some holdouts there. You've got some divisions within the Taliban. You've got, the Haqqani group, which is a designated terrorist organization that pretty much runs Kabul now. You've got the Southern Taliban from Kandahar that was doing, most of the fighting. And then you could almost count the interlocutors, their negotiators, as a third sort of faction that is certainly more savvy about, wanting to position this new regime in a way that, will allow it to accumulate resources. But that's all I had to add.
Let me line up everyone. John Noonan, then followed by Dr. Shadlow, Alex Gray, Christopher Cox. I'm going to ask Mary Kissel to close it off by setting us up for next month, all within 15 minutes. So John Noonan, this is going to be fast for an Air Force man.
Fast is our business in ICBMs, as you know, Hugh. I'll keep this quick. This is a question for Mike Waltz, Congressman Waltz. It has been 58 years since the beginning of the American involvement in the Vietnam War. We're now at a place where America has spent 30 years losing counterinsurgencies. I think we have now spent more time losing wars than we have winning wars, which does not give me any pleasure to say. You fought there. You wrote a book about your experience there. You were well educated at the Virginia Military Institute. I'd like to know if you could go back to 2001, what would you have done differently and what do you think would have worked?
I think you're muted, Congressman. I think you're muted, Congressman.
Hey, Mike, you're still muted.
God damn it. All right, there we go. All right, let me get that into 30 seconds per Hugh's guidance. But look, John, I think number one, we never really managed our expectations effectively in what we're dealing with. Relatively easy to hunt down an individual or to bomb a tank. Very difficult to defeat an idea and defeat an ideology. And just as it has taken us many decades to undermine the ideology of communism and fascism, it is going to take many to defeat the ideology of Islamic extremism, of which we're fighting on battlefields all over the world. And I'm convinced that as long as it is at war with us, we really don't have a choice whether we're going to fight it or not. It's just how do we fight it and learn from our mistakes and fight it better. And while I completely, wholly, and 100% agree with Robert that in our strategic interest, Taiwan looms far larger. I can tell you, as someone that has to stand in front of Americans, in a town hall, that is a much more kind of ethereal argument to make when they're asking me, when are we on a road to another 9/11, another Pulse nightclub, which was just outside my district, another San Bernardino. And so, we have to balance that, and that I do believe it's going to follow us home. We saw that when we went to zero in Iraq, and led to the rise of the ISIS caliphate and attacks across Paris, London, and eventually inspired attacks in the United States. So that's the balance. What does it look like? What would it have looked like? Number one, and this is not an indictment on the liberation of Iraq, but I was there in Afghanistan when I saw the resources leaving, and no nation can fight two wars as well as it fights one. Number two, there has been no counterinsurgency in history that was successful when the enemy enjoyed sanctuary, and we never solved the Pakistan problem. In Vietnam, we never solved the Laos and Cambodia problem. In Colombia, we did solve the sanctuary problem next door. And I believe that's a large reason why we've been much more successful there. We weren't organized as a government to do this well. I gave you an example of the Accords program in Vietnam, where we did, and we didn't empower the locals until much later in the war. So I think, and then finally, we sold ourselves a fiction that NATO could do this as well as us. And because we were so bogged down in Iraq, that we convinced ourselves, and NATO did wonderful work. We couldn't have done it without them. But they also, in many ways, didn't live up to many of the pledges that they made, and tied the hands of those that they did put on the ground with their national caveats for all kinds of political reasons. So, John, it's a number of reasons, but I think if we had addressed each one of those, we would be in a much better place than we are today.
Thank you, Congressman. Dr. Shadlow.
Okay, thanks. I'll be quick. I'd like to go from the past and the recent past to what we can do going forward. I know Congressman Waltz is on the front lines of fighting this on the Hill, but essentially one powerful tool the United States has is withholding recognition of the Taliban. And I'd like to know, I'd like to ask Mike, because he's on the front lines of this, but also Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador O'Brien, about what they think about this. It's really important. Nikki Haley did a great op-ed earlier this summer about not recognizing the Taliban, pointing out that it took us 30 years before we recognized communist China, 20 years before we recognized communist Vietnam. This is really an important pressure point. Opening up aid and funding to the Taliban essentially means we are giving money to a barbaric regime that wants to see our demise. It doesn't make sense. It undermines our entire human rights agenda, but certainly the agenda of the Biden administration on gender equity, right? So there's a lot here, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Mr. Secretary?
Yeah, that's pretty easy. We shouldn't recognize the Taliban.
Mr. Ambassador? Robert O'Brien, are you muted? Okay, how about you?
I'm muted. I was just going to say I agree with Secretary Pompeo 100%.
Congressman Waltz?
Well, add me to the agreement, but I could tell you we're seeing the signs. The administration, the Biden administration is heading down that road. I think they're going to back into it by delisting some key figures in the UN, as Matt Pottinger rightly pointed out, with Chinese support, and we're seeing that movement occur. I'm also talking to a number of allies. The golden prize the Taliban wants right now is access to their foreign currency reserves, about $7 billion held in New York, but about $2 billion spread across a couple of different countries in Europe. Those countries are considering unfreezing those assets because they are incredibly concerned that the economy is going to go from awful to total collapse and even more of a humanitarian disaster. And I have legislation in the NDAA. I don't know if it's going to survive with the Democrats in charge of the House that would ban aid to any country that recognizes a Taliban regime, with a couple of countries that you guys could easily guess in mind. But and then also barring any recognition. And finally, I mean, just what kind of a statement does that make for the United States support of the rule of law? If we have an obvious violent military coup that overthrew, as flawed as the Afghan government was, a democratically developed constitution and constitutional government, we should be recognizing the government in exile, led by Saleh and Massoud, standing with our values, standing with the rule of law, and sending the right signal around the world. But unfortunately, that's not the direction this administration is going.
Thank you, Congressman. On that note, it was too late to get out, but Ambassador Roz, who is accredited from the Afghan government to the United States, has been abandoned by the Department of State and the Department of Defense with no communication for more than 5 weeks since the evacuation on August 30th. Alex Gray, then Christopher Cox, then Mary Kissel.
Yeah, building on John Noonan's question and the kind of the parallels between Vietnam and Afghanistan, I'd be curious, the congressman's take particularly, but also the secretary and the ambassador, looking after Vietnam, there was a lot of introspection about what the U.S. military would look like, force structure, lessons learned, switching to the all-volunteer force. What do you think that the lessons learned from Afghanistan are for the military at kind of that operational level, in terms of training and force structure? And what do you think are the lessons? One of the themes of Vietnam, but also one of the themes of Afghanistan, was a civilian military issue and a divide between the civilians and the military on both of those conflicts. And it played out in Afghanistan with McChrystal, and it played out with all sorts of different flare-ups over 20 years. What do you think are the lessons going forward on the civil military side as well?
Yeah, sure. Just briefly, in the immediate aftermath of Vietnam, and this is one thing the Nixon administration did that was so critical, is we had a political agreement before we pulled everything out, and the South Vietnamese army fought on and was continuing the fight. They really collapsed not when we pulled out our advisors, but when the Congress, for a number of political reasons, stopped the funding. That's what really, truly led to the collapse. And I think if this had been managed very differently, that could have been the case going forward. But I certainly think we would have had ongoing congressional support because of the ongoing threat to the homeland. In terms of military lessons learned, one of them I already spoke to, in that we partnered with the Afghans, we partnered with the Iraqi military, which collapsed under the weight of ISIS very precipitously. We partnered poorly in many cases. In many cases, we wanted to do and thought we could do the fighting better. And I go back to Lawrence of Arabia's old adage of let the Arabs do this at 60 to 70%. That's better than us doing it at 100%. And so even though that we certainly invested a lot, we really had very poor oversight of it. We didn't have the partnerships that we should have. And I think there really are a lot of lessons to be learned there. And the lessons should be learned as places where we've done it better. We've done it better in the Philippines. We've done it better in Colombia, and we've done it better in South Korea with the Katusa program. I would say, though, in terms of managing the timelines and expectations, the South Korean army had a higher illiteracy rate at the end of the Korean War than the Afghan army does today. They were incredibly devastated after years of Japanese occupation and oppression. And I would bet you that if we decided to pull out 20 years into that war in the mid-1970s, they would not have fared nearly as well. So again, I think this expectation of what it takes to develop militaries, it takes generations for them to rise through the ranks and to absorb the lessons that they need to stand on their own. And we're still standing side by side with the South Korean military today as the 12th largest economy in the world. So I think one of the biggest lessons, Alex, is the time and effort it takes over time to partner with, again, 40 years Colombia, 70 years Korea. We can go around the world with how long that we've partnered with these militaries. And if you look at some of them, their starting point was just as bad as it was in Afghanistan.
Christopher Cox.
Thanks, Hugh. Great to be with you all tonight. I just wanted to make a quick point on Vietnam and then a quick question. I think perception always drives reality. And of course, there's a perception that the U.S. lost the war in Vietnam, but the perception among world leaders, and I remember my grandfather telling me this in the 1980s, was that while the U.S. lost the battle of Vietnam, Vietnam was still an integral part to winning the war against communism by breaking off the Chinese from the communist bloc, by isolating North Vietnam, an ally of the Soviet Union. So the Vietnam War was a key part in winning the overall war against communism. And I think the problem with Afghanistan is that the perception is that the Emperor of the United States has no clothes. And that this perception is starting to drive reality. So I think that that's a key difference between Vietnam and Afghanistan. So my question is, what could the United States do that would show that the United States is back, that Afghanistan was something that's transient and wasn't a permanent feature of U.S. decline? What is something that the U.S. foreign policy establishment and government could do to show that the United States is back?
Ambassador O'Brien.
Well, yeah, I pointed out a couple of things at the outset. I won't reiterate those, Chris. It's a great question. I think what we have to understand is that there are some fights that are critical to great power competition, and that's where we need to focus. We've got limited resources, and we have to focus on the Chinese and the Russians, and to a slightly lesser extent the Iranians. We have to get back to it's no longer in fashion, but what's called punitive expeditions. I mean, we've got to go in if we're hit. We've got to go into these countries. We've got to root out the terrorists. We've got to hit them harder. But we just don't have the resources or the political will, unfortunately, to go to places that folks never heard of and stay there for 40, 50, 60 years and watch Americans come back to Dover. We have to go in and hit hard, take out the Osamas, take out the Saddams when they threaten our flyers or our pilots in the no-fly zones. And we need to do what the British did over 200 years with a single army division that they moved around with the Royal Navy. We've got to rebuild our Air Force. We've got to rebuild the Navy. We've got to be prepared for great power competition. And when we get hit hard, or it looks like there's some country that's going to, or some non-state actor within a country that's going to hit us, and we need to go in there, we need to root them out and then be prepared for the next one. I just don't think the idea of us being everywhere at once is going to be for 40 years is going to be workable. And it'd be nice. And if we had a 3 million person military and we had our allies invested in it, we might be able to do that sort of thing. But we're going to have to use smaller groups of special operators and expeditionary forces and go in and take care of business and then move on. And we've got to keep our eye on the ball. The eye is and the ball is Beijing and their partners in Moscow and their lackeys in Tehran. And that's where we've got to be focused 100% right now.
Mr. Secretary.
I'll try to do briefly. How about not spending $5.5 trillion in destroying our economy? When the world looks at America, they are counting on American growth, American innovation in our economy. We're about to do enormous destruction and turn into a European socialist welfare state at the very best. So there's a good one. Robert ticked through a handful of operational, strategic, geopolitical issues, but we should never forget that we've got to make sure we have it right here at home and that the American economic power is the most important tool that we have to deliver in every one of these fights, the fight against the CCP and the fight against radical extremism alike.
So let me close with Mary Kissel, who's going to help me organize next month's topic and our approach. Mary?
I think I've just gotten deputized. Thank you, Hugh. I just wanted to thank everybody for the great discussion tonight. I think we've had agreement in this group in a bipartisan way across the country that the withdrawal from Afghanistan, just to roll back to the topic at hand, was a terribly botched pullout with terrible consequences. I think we had an excellent and a very detailed discussion about tactical issues, about where to move troops, where to put U.S. aid. We've addressed current policy debates, like whether or not to recognize the Taliban and the implications of that. But one thing we didn't do tonight is we didn't really touch on the larger question that Afghanistan raises. And that's simply this: what is the U.S. role abroad? What is the purpose of the exercise of U.S. power? That's really the question that the reaction to Afghanistan is raising. Do we want to promote democracy abroad anymore? Is that in our interests? Should values play a role in how we exercise policy abroad? But never fear, just because we didn't talk about it tonight doesn't mean that we won't talk about it, because next time we're going to talk about Taiwan, which raises all of those similar questions. As we face a communist China, what is the US role? How do we exercise power? What are our interests? How do we promote our values? This is not the United States of the 1940s. It's not the United States of the 1970s. We're past the war on terror. We're in a new era. And I think we're trying to figure out these bigger questions. So we'll very much look forward to that discussion next time. Back to you, Hugh.
Thank you, Mary, for the setup. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Ambassador, the members of the seminar. We are 5 minutes over. I apologize for that, but we will see you on the first Tuesday in November to carry on that conversation that the Secretary opened and that Mary very nicely set up. Thank you all and have a good evening.